Welcome to the Big World Made Small podcast for the adventure traveler. I'm thrilled you're here. My name is Jason Elkins, and in addition to being your host, I'm also a former U.S. Army paratrooper, third-generation commercial hot air balloon pilot, paramotor pilot, ex-Montana fly fishing guide, advanced open water scuba diver, and a full-time nomad that's visited more than 30 countries on 6 continents. As a seasoned adventure travel expert with a passion for creating and sharing meaningful experiences, I'm on a quest to impact the lives of adventure travelers, the tour operators they rely on, and the communities that host them. Every week, I bring you exclusive interviews with fascinating adventure tourism experts who have agreed to share their personal stories, favorite destinations, and some invaluable travel insights they've picked up along the way. We'll enjoy a casual conversation, create some connections, and likely share some laughs. It's my hope that by the end of each episode, this big world will feel just a bit smaller. Let's get started, shall we? Welcome back to another episode of the Big World Made Small Adventure Travel Podcast. Today, we are super excited to have Dale Klerk here with us with Bill Harrop's Original Balloon Safaris. Dale, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Super excited to have you here. As many of our listeners may or may not know, I grew up in a hot air ballooning family. So this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, Dale. And you lead one of the most respected ballooning companies, organizations in the world. And so it's just a real pleasure to have you here with us. Dale, where are you? Yeah, where are you located right now? Where are you sitting as we record this?
Okay, I'm sitting at home in an area called Harrop Dam, which is a dam very close to the area of the Machaliz Valley, where we actually fly or operate our balloon company from. It's about 30 kilometers north of Johannesburg, South Africa.
Okay, great. Because I'm not going to try and repeat any of those names. I've been to South Africa, and I can pronounce Johannesburg, Cape Town, and many of the others are a little bit of outside of my lexicon, I guess. So thanks for sharing that with us. And Johannesburg is kind of in northern South Africa, right?
Correct. So central north, yes. Not quite up in the north, but more north than the middle.
Okay. I definitely want to get into your story, but since we're on the subject of where you are, and since I asked that, I'm curious, around Johannesburg, for those people that aren't familiar with South Africa, what other types of activity? Obviously, you've got the ballooning there, and you know that area was chosen for a reason. But what other kind of activities are right around where you fly?
Okay, around Johannesburg, probably in about 100 kilometer circumference, there's quite a few game parks, lion and rhino parks. There's also activities of mountain climbing. Where we are, there's a nice mountain. South of Johannesburg, there's the Vaal Dam, where there's a lot of boating going on. And then where I live is the Hartbeespoort Dam, where there's boating. And then the capital, which is Pretoria, is slightly northeast of Johannesburg. That's the capital of South Africa. And then the further north you go, the more bush and wildlife we have. And of course, south we have the Karoo, which is a very dry area before you get to the coast, where Cape Town is, of course.
Okay, wonderful. And so now let's jump. This is a good time to jump into your story, because first question I was going to ask you is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Brakpan, which is about 20 kilometers east of Johannesburg. The Johannesburg area is quite a densely populated area for the last 200 odd years because of the gold mining, which was discovered here in the gold reef. And that's partly why it's the more densely populated area of South Africa.
Okay, wonderful. And I know that, in conversations I've had with you in the past, I know that you have not been involved in ballooning your entire life. So help our listeners kind of get a feel for how you got from where you were growing up there, close to Johannesburg, to where you are now, very, similar proximity to Johannesburg, and but your life has changed a little bit. So tell us a little bit about how you got from where you started to where you are now.
Okay, I'm an aviation nut, if you want to put it in plain English. I started flying model airplanes when I was about 7 years old. I had my first flight in an aircraft when I was about 8 years old. Then I started hang gliding when I was, I think, 12 or 13. And I've just been flying ever since. The flying is my life. And one of the people that I met during my flying career, her name is Tracy Robb. Now, she's considered to be the highest hour female balloon pilot in the world. And we were very good friends. And she used to fly for the company, Bill Harrop's original balloon safaris. And when, sadly, Bill, the owner or the guy who started Bill Harrop's balloon safaris, when he passed away, Tracy looked after him when he had COVID, and she got COVID as well. And my wife and I looked after her, and the discussion came up as to what's going to happen to the company. And slowly but surely, we got involved, contacted the state, and eventually here we are. Her and I have taken over the company.
Wow. Okay. There was some really cool stuff there. I want to dig a little deeper. You said you started learning, got into aviation with model airplanes when you were 7, had your first flight at 8, and got into hang gliding around 12. So I think most people listening to this can realize that's a little different trajectory than the typical 12-year-old is taking, sailing off of mountaintops in a hang glider. So
yeah.
I want to hear more about that. I want to know, like, your parents, who was it that encouraged this type of behavior, and what was behind that?
Okay, my older brother, sadly, he's also passed away now. Him and I saw an advert in a magazine for plans to build a hang glider. And we literally bought these plans, built the hang glider out of aluminium tubing, and the covering was a plastic cover those days. And we built this thing and literally went to a mine dump and started running off the edge of the mine dump and taught ourselves to fly. And the funny thing is, my mother didn't object. She just said, as long as we don't ride motorbikes, we can fly anything we like.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because that was going to be the next question is, where was your adult supervision as you were doing this? And I guess you answered that. And I tend to agree. I sometimes correlate flying to maybe motorcycle riding, and I've been flying most of my life. I started learning to fly when I was 12, as well. So in a balloon, and had the full support of my parents. And I came to the conclusion as well that flying is much safer than riding a motorcycle down pretty much any street. So I can appreciate that. So, but did your parents or family or anybody other than just you and your brother have this interest in aviation, or it's just fascinating?
Yeah, the model aircraft came from my dad. He used to build model aircraft and fly them. Not very successfully in those days because the electronic equipment in the early 60s was not all that great. But we all learned to fly model airplanes with my dad. He never flew any full-size aircraft, but that's where I think the bug bit. Once we'd gotten into the model airplanes and the hang gliding, it just progressed from there.
Okay, so did you go from, so what came after the hang gliding? I'm just fascinated, but kind of the series of events. Did this lead you directly into a career in aviation, or did you do something else for a while? The quote unquote real job, or what did that look like for you?
Okay, from hang gliding, which I did for, can't remember exactly how many years, but quite a number of years. And then we met a friend that introduced us to sailplanes or gliders. You might know them as sailplanes. Mm-hmm. And then I started flying sailplanes. I also did a short stint in the Air Force, which was at that stage mandatory in South Africa. But I did some flying in the Air Force as well. And then I did my fixed-wing private pilot license, and later on became an instructor. And I also run a fixed-wing flying school, which has been going for many years now.
So have you ever had a job or a business that was not aviation related?
Yes, I did. For 20 years, I was actually involved in furniture manufacturing as well, but I also flew at the same time. I didn't ever stop flying. But I did have to make a living elsewhere because aviation doesn't seem to make enough money to support all my crazy ideas.
I understand. I think there's a few kind of careers in the aviation space that maybe pay the bills, but possibly don't give you the flexibility that I'm kind of sensing you probably enjoy. Because I think there's people that fly because it's a good job. Maybe if you're one of the airlines and you're just doing that consistently, but I sense you're a little bit more of a kind of entrepreneurial type and more of an adventure. I shouldn't say more of an adventure, but I definitely sense that in everything you've told me so far. So that's very cool. Do you still have the furniture business, or is that in the past?
No, I sold that in 2003, so that's quite a while ago. But yeah, you're quite right. I think I am more of an adventurous type of person. I've never flown for the airlines. I've never had the inclination to fly for the airlines. I've always enjoyed the smaller aircraft, aerobatic flying. I was very competitive in my gliding career. I won several competitions there. And then when I went into fixed wing flying, I did a lot of what they call rally flying. I was South African champion for 10 years in a row. And in 2003, I was, together with a very good friend of mine, Nigel Hopkins, I was world champion in rally flying.
Okay. So help for those of us that, including myself, that don't really know what rally flying is that I've seen, videos of the Red Bull type of races and stuff like that. Is that
okay?
Now tell us more.
Yeah, the Red Bull races, I would love to have done something like that, but that's very intensive flying from a high speed and very precision orientated. What rally flying is very similar to rally car racing, where you get a map that you have to fly to various turn points around about a 200 nautical mile course. But instead of racing, you nominate your own speed. So you can nominate any speed you like, but you can't exceed your speed or fly any slower. And you're not allowed to slow down by circling or weaving. You have to simply maintain your speed. And they log your speed with an electronic logger, so to check that you don't cheat. And along the way, you need to identify certain objects where they give you clues to identify these and mark where they are. And you've also got to obviously find all the turn points and do all this while you're maintaining a very, very specific speed. You're only allowed 3 seconds grace. So you can go 3 seconds ahead of your time or 3 seconds behind your time. If you exceed that, then you get penalized.
So it sounds like a mix of scavenger hunt and precision flying exercise and patience and all kinds of things are mixed together for that.
Very much so, and I promise you, it's hard work, but I loved every minute of it.
Did you know kind of the route? And I'm curious how much time you have to plan something like that. Do you just kind of show up and they say, okay, here are the checkpoints, what's your speed? You've got 5 minutes, figure it out, or is this more a lot of strategizing to make this all work? Because it does sound like there's a lot of moving parts.
You get a map and you get a clue sheet and you have 15 minutes to work it out. And sometimes you don't finish working it out and you've already got to get airborne. So while you're flying, you're still doing some of the calculations. But that's what makes it so interesting, because it's high pressure. And of course, you've got to make damn sure that you're on track, because if you do go off track, that's the end of your flight for that day.
Yeah. Is this typically you're flying this solo typically, or do you have a co-pilot, or what does that look like?
No, that's a pilot and co-pilot. So there's 2 of us on board.
Okay. And maybe you mentioned that. I apologize. I've got so many things rolling around in my head. This is really, really fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. And are you still doing that, or is that, have you moved on?
No, I've moved on. I still fly, obviously, but I don't fly the rally flying competitively anymore. And I've also stopped aerobatic flying. I'm 65 years old this year. Not that I think that that's old, but I need to sort of calm down a little bit and do something sensible like flying balloons.
Like flying balloons. Yeah, I get it. And I do want to share with you a story. I worked in real estate for a while, and I had a client who was in the Air Force in Arizona. He was like a 35 pilot, and had been doing it for a while. And I'd mentioned to him that I was also a pilot, and started that conversation. I said, "Well, I have a commercial hot air balloon pilot's license." And so I had a few other conversations with people. They're like, "Well, why would you do that? You can't control it." And there's something to be said for ballooning. It's slower, maybe quite. I can see why it might appeal to you with the rally flying, because it's quite a bit different than the speed and the intensity. It's a lot of planning ahead. For those that, listeners that don't know, every time you impart some sort of maneuver into a balloon, or you take action to create a change in altitude, or that, there's a lag. It takes a little while, so you got to plan ahead a little bit. So it sounds a lot like kind of like the rally flying. Yeah.
That lag has caught me out a few times.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're learning to fly balloons now, right? So you got involved in the business, and I'm not sure where to start that part of the conversation, but I think it's important that you are expanding into flying balloons and getting licensed in balloons, because there's a lot of similarities, but obviously it's a slightly different skill set. So tell us a little bit about your journey as you're learning to fly, and then we'll connect that back around with how do you have a hot air balloon ride business if you're not licensed as a commercial pilot? Who are you working with? Who are your partners? How does that all work?
Okay, I am learning to fly a hot air balloon. Now, I don't know what the regulations are worldwide. I think they're pretty similar, but you've got to get a hot air balloon private pilot license first, which I haven't quite got to yet. I'm working my way towards that. Then once you've got your private pilot license, you need to build 100 hours of pilot in command before you can fly commercially in a hot air balloon. Now, as you know, with ballooning, especially in South Africa, we only fly very early in the mornings because it gets extremely hot and windy. So we can't fly many hours in one day. So we average maybe 1 or 2 hours a day. Also, with managing the company and pulling the company into, call it production again since COVID, which we'll get into a bit later, I've spent a lot of time in running the business. So I haven't actually got involved in the flying side of it yet. However, I've got, as I said, my partner, Tracy Robb, who's a 5,000-hour balloon pilot. Then I have another lady by the name of Felicity Klerk, who's in the region of 3,000-hour commercial balloon pilot. And I have Eugene Schultz, who's also 3,000-hour balloon pilot. And Nick Duffield, who's also around 3,000-hour commercial balloon pilot. And then very recently, we've started a balloon school, and we have trained the first South African black South African commercial balloon pilot. His name is Michael Maja. And how that came about is, before my time, his mother worked for the Harrop family. And as a kid, he started as a crew member and learned all about ballooning in his younger days. And when I got involved in the company, I just heard about this little guy that was always there, but he's now gone and he's off on his own mission. And I contacted him and said to him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I was studying law, but I ran out of funds and I'm not getting to where I want to get. And I said, well, would you like to carry on with your ballooning career? Which is exactly what he did. And he's now recently, about 3 months ago, qualified as the first black South African commercial balloon pilot. So we got 5 pilots flying for us, and that gives me a chance to actually do the management side of it.
Very, very cool. I'm happy that this conversation came up, because in my experience, I grew up around ballooning. I've been around balloons my entire life, and there's a few questions that I frequently hear. And one of them comes from a place of surprise. It's like, oh, you need a license to fly those? So I'm happy that this came up, because if if listeners are thinking, well, geez, I didn't even know you need a license to fly balloons. It's important to know that. So if you're going out somewhere and you want to go for a balloon ride, I think it's valuable to know that the pilot flying for you, with you, taking you on the flight, that there are requirements and certifications. You mentioned minimum 100 hours. That might not sound like a lot to some people. I get that. And ballooning is an interesting thing because we only typically fly about 1 hour at a time, which is
Yeah,
another question that comes up. You mentioned that we fly early in the mornings. Some places we're also able to fly late in the evenings. And as you said, that has to do with temperature. And the temperature plays an impact on the winds because anybody that's listening that isn't aware of this, winds are created by variations in temperature on the ground. So as the sun comes up and heats the atmosphere, heats the ground, you start to get uplift and downlift and all these things. It's like water boiling. I used to describe it. Imagine you put a pot of water on the stove, and when it's cold, the water's just calm. And as you start to heat it up, the bottom of the pan starts to warm up. And eventually you start to see the water kind of circulating and boiling. And that's a good visual. You can see that you can imagine that in a pot of water. It's a little harder to imagine it in the middle of the day when it's noon and it's like, okay, it's hot out, but you don't see the air moving around the way it really does. So that's why we fly in the mornings and evenings. And like you
that's a
said,
very good example. That's exactly what happened.
yeah, it is. And it's like until you visualize that, it's like, oh, now I get it. Sometimes, if you're out in the desert somewhere where it's really dry, you might see those dust devils in the middle of the day. That's a visual representation that we don't often see. But if you see a dust devil, those currents are usually still there, whether there's a dust devil or not. So yeah. And with balloons, we can't just point it where we want to go and hit the throttle and go. So we're pretty much going to go wherever the wind is going. So if the wind is bouncing around like boiling water, you can imagine how difficult it might be to navigate and control the balloon. So I love that came up. And then the hours thing, every flight is about an hour. So every hour you've got the whole planning process, the launch, the inflation, the flight itself, which is not always the technically challenging part. It's it's the launch, the inflation, and the landing. So for every hour you have a full cycle of that. So it's not just I get my balloon and I fly for 8 hours a day for a couple weeks, and then I've got my hours built up. It takes a while to accumulate that time. Most pilots, it might take them 6 months to a year before they're able to accumulate 100 hours, and then you've got 100 launches and 100 landings. We're in a balloon, or in an airplane, you can just fly around for, I don't know. I'm not an airplane pilot, but it's quicker and easier to accumulate hours in an airplane. So,
definitely. And we find for every balloon hour that you fly, it's a cycle of about 3 to 3.5 hours. And I'm also, as I said, involved in fixed wing flying as an instructor, and have been. Intensity of the balloon training is as much or slightly more even than what we do in fixed wing. I believe that our standards are very high in South Africa, fixed wing or otherwise, and our balloon training is definitely just as high. So I can safely say that any of our balloon pilots are highly, highly qualified. So anybody that does get into a hot air balloon with a commercial pilot can rest assured that it's not just some guy that's found a balloon somewhere and flying it. It's definitely a very well trained, and there's also a lot of recurrency training and checks and balances that we have to do. So that does put people's mind at ease that it's not an unsafe sport at all.
I'm going to ask you one of the questions I've been asked many times before is I'm just going to ask, how do you steer a balloon?
You don't. Simple. Okay, no. You do steer a balloon simply by monitoring the weather and winds. Now, when I say winds, it's obviously early in the morning, not strong winds, but there are breezes, and there's winds or drafts or currents in different directions at different altitudes. And we have often found that within a 2,000 foot level, you can have currents in 3 different directions. And that's basically how you steer the balloon. So you move from one current into the other one, go in one direction, then you change direction by changing altitude, and then you go in a different direction. And if you're very good and you're very lucky, you can actually land where you took off. But that takes quite a bit of skill.
And a little bit of cooperation from the wind currents. Because the one definite thing is you cannot take a balloon in a direction that the wind is not going. Now, you might go up and find a wind that may be going that direction, but like you said, it's a lot of things have to come together. So if you don't land at the same place, how do you get back?
Okay, well, we've got 7 balloons in our company, of which 3 of them are 415, which is 410,000 cubic feet of air. They carry about 16 people at a time. So that's the interesting thing about ballooning. There's a lot of crew for one single balloon flight. You have a vehicle, which is normally a 4x4 vehicle with a trailer, that has to retrieve the balloon, because when you land in a field, in a farmer's field somewhere, you can't just carry the balloon out, because your basket alone weighs about close on 1,000 pounds, and your envelope of your balloon also weighs about 1,000 pounds. So that's quite heavy. That needs to be recovered and loaded on a trailer and brought back. And then we have a little minibus, a 16-seater minibus, which also goes out and collects the passengers and brings them back to base. But we have a tradition, which I'm sure is a tradition everywhere in the world, coming from the Montgolfier brothers, is when we land, we first serve everybody with some champagne for a successful flight, which we do in the middle of the farmer's field. We make sure that we don't mess up his field, and sometimes the farmer even gets invited, and they enjoy that.
That's a super fun part of it. And as that came up, I wasn't intending for that to come up, but I'm happy it did, because that's something. It's an interesting story that I'm sure most of the people listening to this have never heard. Maybe if they've been on a balloon flight. But yes, it was the Montgolfier brothers back in 1783? 1783. Was it?
On the 21st of November, which is only 2 or 3 days ago.
Yes. So we're recording this in November, so we just passed that celebration. But it goes back to France, the Montgolfier brothers. That nobody had ever flown before. No man had ever actually left the ground in any way that you would call flying, other than maybe jumping off of something. But I don't even believe in any sort of hang glider that was successful. But anyway, these 2 brothers, they own a paper manufacturing company in Paris. And the version of the story I heard is the one brother was sitting there next to the fire making his notes one night, and his wife's knickers were hanging up on the line, drying next to the fire. And a little kind of waft of hot air had come out of the fire and lifted her knickers up off the line. And he got this idea. He thought, we own a paper company. Let's make a big bag, and maybe we can get the hot air, or the smoke, actually, is what they thought it was the smoke. So they thought, we're going to make a big bag, fill it full of smoke, and when it has enough smoke in it, we'll cut it loose and it'll float off into the air. So they started experimenting, and eventually they were able to build one big enough that they were able to lift some animals off the ground, and then eventually even people. And so they had this idea that they wanted to put a person into the air, and they were trying to figure out, well, who should this be? Because they weren't sure what was up there. If it was toxic gases, what was going to happen if you went off into the air? Would you die? Was it going to be safe? And the story I heard was that they were trying to decide if maybe they should send some condemned prisoners, because if it didn't work out, then no big deal. But then, of course, there was the other camp that said, well, why would we want to give that honor to a prisoner? So there were 2 brave men, Jean Pilatre de Rosière, and I cannot think of the other guy's name.
Yeah, I don't
in the moment. I'll think of it as soon as we get past. What's that? Do you remember? Anyway, these 2 French kind of scientist adventure types, they got the big bag, they filled it full of smoke. When it was ready, they threw on a bunch of rotten wood and carcasses and all this stuff, because they thought it was the smoke really that helped it rise. Yeah. So they funneled the smoke up into the big bag. And when they thought it was ready, the two guys jumped on board, they cut the ropes, and they flew off into the countryside in this big orb, billowing smoke. And you can imagine this was back before they had radio, television, internet, and all that stuff. So you can imagine these farmers out working in the fields. You look up and see this orb billowing smoke, and it comes down and lands in their field. So oftentimes they'd run out there with pitchforks and all kinds of stuff to confront whatever was going on. And they'd get out there, and these guys climbed out of the balloon just covered in soot from the fire and from the smoke, and they looked like demons. So you can imagine that was not such a good thing. So I guess they decided, if we're going to keep doing this, we probably better bring something with us that shows that we're not demons and that we come in good faith. So they're Frenchmen. So what do you think they decided to bring? Was champagne, the obvious choice. So they would carry champagne with them. So when they'd meet these landowners, they'd pull out the champagne. The landowners would realize, okay, they come in peace, and they would share a toast of toast the champagne, and everybody was happy. And that was kind of, what I heard was the story about why we still to this day, good smart balloonists always carry a bottle of champagne to either present or share with the landowner when they land. And it's absolutely true. When you land in someone's field, hopefully it's not a full crop, but when you land in somebody's field and they come out to greet you and you've got a bottle of champagne in your hand for them, it tends to help. So anyway,
Definitely.
That was the story I heard. I'm sure there's a few different variations. I've actually heard a few different variations, but anyway, it's kind of cool. So whenever I think of champagne, it takes me back to that story. And so it's fun. So anybody listening to this, go for a balloon ride and make sure you ask for the champagne or about the champagne. It's an important part of the tradition. So anyway.
Oh, it's definitely it's part of the tradition. If you don't have the champagne, you haven't gone on a balloon ride.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I know some balloonists that we don't mess with that. Okay, well, I like tradition myself, and I tend to find that the past anyway. So with the company, so it's Bill Harrop's original balloon safaris. So I did want to ask you about the name because it's quite unique in all of the ballooning community. I can't really off the top of my head think of any organization that really kind of emphasizes the word original. So tell us a little bit more about that, where Bill came up with that, or was it did he start with that name, or did that change over time? Where did that come about?
Okay, the first guy that flew a balloon in South Africa, his name was Terry Adams. He's still alive today, but very old. He's in his 90s already. And I can't remember if he taught Bill or if Bill just taught himself, but Bill was basically the second balloon pilot in South Africa. But at that stage, they were basically sport balloons and very small, 60,000 cubic feet. And 6,000 cubic feet. Anyway, Bill got the idea of starting a commercial operation, which he started in 1981. And as far as we can ascertain, his company was most definitely the first commercial balloon operation in Africa and possibly the Southern Hemisphere. And he registered that name in 1981, Bill Harrop's original balloon safaris.
He seems like that was fairly foresighted to just say, you know what, let's just start with that instead of going back later, because I wondered if that was like, well, did other people come in and try and take his name? And so he was trying to, distinguish himself as the original one, but that shows a tremendous amount of foresight into that. And, you mentioned something else that I want to touch on as well, because I think it's interesting is, you mentioned smaller sport balloons that are usually, you mentioned 60,000 cubic feet. You mentioned the bigger balloons that carry 16 passengers might be like 400. I think you said 425,000 cubic feet.
Correct, yeah.
Those are big. Those are big balloons. Anybody that's around ballooning probably kind of understands what that is. But to put it into perspective, someone once I think it was my father. I was going to say someone. I'm pretty sure it was my dad, because I grew up with him. And I learned to fly on a balloon that was 84,000 cubic feet. And you tell people that, and it's really hard to get your head around it. And he used to say, imagined 84,000 NBA basketballs.
Yeah.
84,000 NBA basketballs gives you an idea of just how big a 84,000 cubic foot balloon is.
And
So
that's a small.
420. Yeah, and so think 425,000 NBA basketballs, and you start to get your head around just how big this thing is. That's almost that's 500,000 basketballs. So and people that haven't been up close to balloons just really have no idea just how big they can be. So it's a pretty cool thing.
And what other people don't realize is that air has mass, and all the air inside that balloon has mass as well. So that is why a balloon that big has got such an inertia and kinetic energy. So hence why you need to have training and start with a smaller balloon and work your way up to be able to fly and control one of those big balloons.
It's hard to imagine, but like even a big balloon like that moving at 5 to 10 miles an hour. We generally don't fly much over 10, sometimes depending on the situation conditions. But let's just for example, say 10 miles an hour. So you think, 10 miles an hour, and it's just full of air. It's light. It's lighter than air. That's kind of what we call ballooning. It's lighter than air aviation. And if you're standing on the ground and a balloon that size is coming towards you at 10 miles an hour, you're not going to stop it. It's it's like hitting a truck almost.
No, that'll knock the car flying.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we mentioned earlier, we got to kind of plan ahead. We don't have wheels. We're not landing on a runway. It's quite literally, it's just dragging. Like when we're moving slow, we still drag a little bit. Pilots might not say dragging, but that's really what it is. You got to get enough friction between the bottom of the basket and the earth to actually stop the forward momentum of the balloon. I trust you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you're enjoying the Big World Made Small podcast, please take a moment to tell the algorithm by subscribing and posting a review so that others can benefit as well. I also invite you to take a quick trip over to bigworldmadesmall.com and join our private adventure travel community to receive new episode notifications, special access to our guest experts, and perhaps even some exclusive partner offers that we haven't discussed on the podcast. I'll publish another episode soon. Until then, keep exploring. It's the best way to make a big world feel just a bit smaller.